April 18, 1942, 8:20 USS Hornet, Pacific Ocean. The deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet is pitching violently in the heavy swells of the North Pacific. Salt spray lashes across the flight deck, slicking the wood and steel where 16 B-25 Mitchell medium bombers sit lashed in two lines. These are land-based Army planes, never designed to operate from a carrier, and they look dangerously out of place, too wide, too heavy, and far too large for the floating runway beneath them. At the head of the line in aircraft number 1 sits Lieutenant Colonel James "Jimmy" Doolittle. The engines of his bomber are roaring, the Wright cyclones vibrating the airframe as he watches the flagmen on the deck. The situation is far from ideal. In fact, by any standard military calculation, the mission is already compromised. Just hours earlier, the task force had been spotted by a Japanese patrol boat. The element of surprise, the single most critical component of this audacious plan, had evaporated. The original plan called for a launch much closer to the Japanese home islands, ensuring the bombers would have enough fuel to reach safe airfields in China. But with the enemy alerted, Vice Admiral William "Bull" Halsey had made the hard call: launch immediately. They are 650 miles from Japan. The math is unforgiving. Every mile added to the approach is a mile subtracted from their escape. Doolittle watches the bow of the Hornet dip into a trough and then heave upward on the crest of a 30-foot wave. He has 467 feet of runway. It is a distance that would be considered dangerously short on a concrete airfield. On a moving ship, laden with 4 500-pound bombs and extra fuel tanks, it is a suicide run. The flagman drops his arm. Doolittle releases the brakes. The B-25 lurches forward. The crew of the Hornet holds its breath as the bomber gathers speed, fighting the gale force winds blowing over the deck. As the carrier's bow rises on the swell, Doolittle pulls back on the yoke. The landing gear leaves the deck with feet to spare. The bomber dips perilously toward the whitecaps before the engines bite into the cold air, clawing for altitude. One by one, the remaining 15 bombers follow. It is a slow, agonizing procession. Each pilot has to time the waves, rev the engines to their limit, and trust that the lift will come before the water does. Miraculously, all 16 planes make it into the air. 80 men, 52 officers and 28 enlisted, are now airborne, flying low over the gray expanse of the Pacific, heading west toward an enemy that believes its homeland is untouchable. The flight to Japan takes hours. They fly at wave-top level to avoid radar detection, maintaining radio silence. Inside the cockpits, the tension is palpable. These men are volunteers, drawn from the 17th Bombardment Group, and they know the strategic reality of the war. Since December 7, 1941, the United States has suffered defeat after defeat. Pearl Harbor is a smoking memory. The Philippines are falling. The Pacific seems to be becoming a Japanese lake. President Roosevelt had asked for a strike to boost morale, a way to hit back. This is it. Around 12:30 hours local time, the coast of Japan appears on the horizon. Doolittle pulls his aircraft up to 1,500 feet. Below them lies Tokyo. To the citizens of the capital, the sight of twin-engine bombers overhead is confusing but not immediately terrifying. Air raid drills are common, and the silhouette of the B-25 is unfamiliar. It isn't until the bomb bay doors open that the reality of the war arrives on their doorstep. Doolittle lines up on an industrial sector. His bombardier releases 4 incendiary bombs. They tumble down, striking factories and oil storage facilities. Across the city, and in Yokohama, Yokosuka, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka, the other raiders are doing the same. The physical damage is, in the grand scope of the war, negligible. A few dozen buildings burn. About 50 people are killed and 400 injured. Compared to the firebombing campaigns that will come years later, this is a pinprick. But the psychological impact is nuclear. The Japanese military leadership had promised the emperor and the people that the home islands were inviolate, protected by the divine wind and the imperial navy. That promise has just been broken. The smoke rising over Tokyo proves that the war can come home. But for the 80 Americans in the sky, the mission is only half over. As they turn west, leaving the chaos of Tokyo behind them, they face a new enemy, the fuel gauge. The early launch has cost them dearly. They are supposed to land at friendly airfields in unoccupied China, where homing beacons are scheduled to guide them in. But as they cross the East China Sea, the weather deteriorates. A storm front moves in, bringing heavy rain and zero visibility. Night falls, turning the cockpits into dark, cramped cages of anxiety. The engines begin to sputter as the tanks run dry. They are over the coast of China now, but in the darkness and the storm, there is no way to spot a runway. The homing beacons are silent. Doolittle makes the decision. He orders his crew to bail out. At roughly 21:30 hours, over a rice paddy near Tyne Mu Shen, the leader of the raid jumps into the black void. He lands in a mixture of mud and night soil, uninjured but exhausted. Around him, across a vast stretch of Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces, other crews are doing the same. 15 of the 16 B-25s crash or are abandoned in China. One plane, critically low on fuel and suffering from high consumption, diverts north to the Soviet Union, where the crew is promptly interned. The wreckage of the American bombers is scattered across the Chinese countryside. For the men on the ground, the situation is precarious. They are in occupied territory or, at best, the gray zones where Japanese patrols operate frequently. Doolittle, after gathering himself from the rice paddy, encounters the local population. The language barrier is absolute, but the intent is clear. He identifies himself as American, Ma Li Ki. The reaction of the Chinese civilians is immediate and courageous. Despite the risk of severe punishment by the occupying Japanese forces, the locals mobilize. They hide the airmen, feed them, and guide them through the intricate network of trails to safety. Of the 80 raiders, 64 are rescued by the Chinese. It is a remarkable feat of coordination and bravery by the local populace and the Chinese soldiers. But not everyone slips through the net. The crew of the 6th bomber, piloted by Lieutenant Dean E. Hallmark, is forced to ditch in the water off the coast. 2 crew members drown. Hallmark and the survivors make it to shore, only to be captured by Japanese forces. In total, 8 Americans fall into enemy hands. The treatment of these prisoners marks a dark turn in the conflict. The Japanese military is humiliated by the raid and enraged by the breach of their defenses. They view the airmen not as lawful combatants, but as criminals who dared to attack the emperor's city. 3 of the captured raiders, Lieutenants Dean E. Hallmark and William G. Farrow, along with Sergeant Harold A. Spatz, are sentenced to death. On October 15, 1942, in a public cemetery in Shanghai, the 3 Americans are executed by firing squad. A 4th prisoner, Lieutenant Robert J. Metter, will waste away in the harsh conditions of his confinement, succumbing to beriberi and dysentery on December 1, 1943. For the Japanese High Command, these executions are a grim attempt to restore a sense of order and superiority, a message that the sacred soil of the empire cannot be violated without the ultimate penalty. But the execution of 3 men does little to quell the fury in Tokyo. The Doolittle Raid has shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. The Imperial Army and Navy have lost face, not just before their emperor but before the world. The fact that the American bombers had not only struck Tokyo but had then vanished into the vastness of China is unacceptable. The realization that Chinese civilians, farmers, villagers, and local militias are actively shielding the pilots adds a layer of betrayal to the humiliation. The rescue of 64 Americans is seen as a direct act of war by the population of the Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces. The response from the Imperial General Headquarters is swift, calculated, and horrifyingly disproportionate. The order is given to launch the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign. Its stated military objective is to seize the airfields where the Americans intended to land, ensuring they can never be used to strike the homeland again. But the operational reality is punitive. It is a mission of extermination. In May 1942, barely a month after Doolittle's B-25s fell from the sky, the Imperial Japanese Army mobilizes over 50 battalions. They move into the eastern provinces with a directive that echoes the darkest philosophies of total war. The objective is to create a sanitized zone, a buffer of terror that will discourage any future assistance to Allied forces. The campaign that follows is not a series of battles in the traditional sense. It is a systematic dismantling of a society. The Japanese columns move through the countryside, targeting the very towns and hamlets that had offered sanctuary to the raiders. The village of Tine Mu Shen, near where Doolittle himself had billeted out, lies directly in the path of this juggernaut. For the Chinese civilians living in these lush, river-fed provinces, the war had been a constant backdrop, but this offensive is different. It is personal. Soldiers sweep through villages with torches and bayonets. The infrastructure of survival, granaries, livestock, and homes is methodically destroyed. The Japanese troops are thorough. They burn the crops in the fields to ensure famine follows in their wake. They slaughter draft animals so the land cannot be tilled. The scale of the destruction is difficult to comprehend. Over an area of roughly 20,000 square miles, the Imperial Army lays waste to everything standing. It is a scorched earth policy enforced with medieval brutality. Any village suspected of harboring an American, or even possessing a scrap of a parachute or a piece of wreckage, is erased. The search for the Doolittle flyers becomes a pretext for mass murder. The human cost is staggering. While the American raid resulted in 50 deaths in Japan, the retaliatory campaign claims an estimated 250,000 Chinese lives. 250,000 civilians, men, women, and children, are killed in a span of 4 months. In addition to the civilian toll, 70,000 Chinese soldiers fall attempting to stem the Japanese advance. The disparity in casualties is a grim testament to the mechanics of reprisal. For every American airman rescued, thousands of Chinese citizens pay with their lives. But the sword and the torch are not the only weapons deployed. In a terrifying escalation, the Japanese military activates Unit 731 and its affiliated detachments. This is the Empire's Biological and Chemical Warfare Division, a unit that operates in the deepest shadows of military ethics. As the Japanese forces prepare to withdraw from certain areas in late summer, they engage in sabotage of the most insidious kind. They poison the wells. They contaminate the food supplies, but they also deploy pathogens directly. Cholera, typhoid, and plague bacteria are spread across the region. The intent is to leave behind a legacy of death that will continue to kill long after the soldiers have marched away. However, the deployment of these biological agents is chaotic and often blows back on the aggressors. In the heat and confusion of the campaign, with supply lines stretched and sanitation poor, the Japanese troops themselves fall victim to their own biological weapons. The microscopic killers do not distinguish between a Chinese peasant and a soldier of the emperor. It is estimated that 10,000 Japanese soldiers fall ill with the very diseases they were ordered to spread. 1,700 of them die, victims of their own government's desperation to punish the Chinese populace. The tragedy of the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign is often overshadowed by the larger naval battles of 1942, but it remains one of the most brutal episodes of the Pacific War. It reveals the terrible calculus of the conflict. A daring, morale-boosting raid by 80 Americans triggers a humanitarian catastrophe for their allies. The Chinese people, who had opened their doors to the strangers falling from the sky, absorbed the full force of Japan's vengeance. While the fires burn in China, the strategic ripples of the raid are spreading across the Pacific, altering the course of the war in ways Doolittle could not have foreseen when he pushed his throttles forward on the Hornet. In Tokyo, the psychological shock of the raid forces Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's hand. The primary architect of the Pearl Harbor attack had long argued that the U.S. Navy's carrier fleet had to be destroyed to secure Japan's perimeter. The Doolittle Raid silences his critics. The vulnerability of the Emperor's palace proves that the defensive perimeter is too porous. The American carriers, the gray ghosts that delivered the bombers, must be hunted down and sunk. Yamamoto sets his sights on a small atoll in the Central Pacific, a strategic stepping stone he believes the Americans will be forced to defend. Midway. The Doolittle Raid, militarily insignificant in terms of physical damage to Tokyo, becomes the catalyst for the decisive naval engagement of the war. By drawing the Japanese fleet out to Midway in June 1942, the raid inadvertently sets the stage for the catastrophic loss of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, a blow from which the Imperial Navy will never recover. Back in the United States, the news of the raid electrifies the public. After months of grim headlines, the fall of Wake Island, the surrender of Bataan, the loss of the Philippines, the bombing of Tokyo is the first tangible proof that victory is possible. The details of the raid are kept secret. President Roosevelt coyly tells reporters the bombers came from Shangri-La, a fictional land from the novel Lost Horizon. But the message is clear. The United States has the reach and the resolve to strike the enemy heartland. James Doolittle, the man who orchestrated and led the impossible mission, initially believes his career is over. Standing in the wreckage of his plane in China, he had lamented to his crew that he would likely be court-martialed for losing all 16 aircraft. He felt he had failed to deliver the bombers to the Chinese Air Force as promised and had accomplished little tactical damage. He could not be more wrong. The United States needs a hero, and Doolittle fits the mold perfectly. Instead of a court-martial, he receives a promotion. He skips the rank of colonel entirely, jumping 2 grades to brigadier general. In a ceremony at the White House, President Roosevelt awards him the Medal of Honor. The citation praises his conspicuous leadership above and beyond call of duty, and with the personal risk involved in leading the first strike against the Japanese homeland. But as the medal is placed around his neck, Doolittle's thoughts are likely not on the polished floors of the Oval Office, but on the muddy fields of Zhejiang and the gray waters of the China Sea. He accepts the honor not for himself, but on behalf of the 80 men who followed him into the unknown. He knows, perhaps better than anyone in that room, that the cost of this mission is still being tallied, not in dollars or aircraft, but in blood. While flashbulbs pop in Washington, the grim reality of the war remains hidden in the shadows of the celebrations. The Medal of Honor around Doolittle's neck symbolizes the courage of the 80 volunteers, but it cannot protect the men still trapped behind enemy lines. While the general stands in the safety of the Oval Office, 4 of his men, the survivors of the captured crews who were not executed, are beginning a long, dark descent into solitary confinement. They are the living ghosts of the raid, men like Lieutenant George Barr and Corporal Jacob de Chazer, who will spend the rest of the war in starvation and torture, their existence officially denied by the Japanese government. For the 4 men left behind in the damp, rat-infested cells of the Japanese military prison system, the war stops being a global conflict and shrinks to the size of a 4 by 8 foot concrete box. Lieutenant George Barr, Lieutenant Robert Hite, Lieutenant Chase Nielsen, and Corporal Jacob de Chazer are classified as war criminals, a designation that strips them of the protections of the Geneva Convention. They are subjected to a regimen designed to break the human spirit. They are starved, beaten, and forced to sit at attention for hours on end, forbidden to speak or move. The psychological torture is as precise as the physical abuse. They are told that the United States has been defeated, that their families believe them dead, and that they have been abandoned by the country they swore to serve. De Chazer, the bombardier from plane number 16, the last B-25 to launch from the Hornet, finds himself locked in a battle for his sanity. In the solitude of his confinement, the young corporal from Oregon begins to reflect on the hatred that fueled his enlistment after Pearl Harbor. Under the crushing weight of isolation, that hatred begins to curdle into despair. It is a darkness that will last for 40 months. While Doolittle is feted in Washington, these men are rotting in Shanghai and later Nanjing, their bodies ravaged by malnutrition and disease. They become the forgotten casualties of the raid, men whose war is fought not with bombs and machine guns, but with the sheer will to draw another breath in a hostile darkness. While the majority of the raiders struggle through the mountains of China and the unfortunate 8 endure the brutality of Japanese captivity, one crew faces a bizarre and entirely different fate. The crew of the 8th bomber, piloted by Captain Edward York, realizes early in the mission that their fuel consumption is dangerously high. A faulty carburetor has been bleeding their reserves since takeoff, As they approach the Japanese coast, York makes a cold calculation. They have enough gas to drop their bombs, but not enough to reach the designated landing zones in China. Bailout over the open ocean is a death sentence. York makes the only decision that offers a chance of survival. He turns north. Breaking formation, the B-25 heads toward the Soviet Union. The USSR is an allied power in the fight against Nazi Germany, but in the Pacific, they maintain a strict neutrality pact with Japan. Stalin is terrified of opening a second front in the east, while the Wehrmacht is hammering at the gates of Moscow and Stalingrad. When York's bomber touches down on a rough airstrip near Vladivostok, the Americans believe they have found sanctuary. Instead, they find a diplomatic nightmare. The Soviet authorities immediately impound the aircraft. The crew is treated politely but firmly. They are not guests, they are internees. To release them would be a violation of international law and a provocation to Tokyo. For over a year, York and his men are shuffled between holding locations in the Russian interior, living in a strange limbo. They are fed and housed, but they are prisoners of geography and politics. It will take a covert operation by the NKVD, staged to look like an escape into Iran in 1943, to finally bring them back to the war. Their B-25 remains in Soviet hands, dissected and studied by Russian engineers desperate to unlock the secrets of American aviation technology. Back in China, the extraction of the 64 survivors is evolving into a logistical miracle. The crash sites are scattered across hundreds of miles of rugged, mountainous terrain. The weather remains abysmal, and Japanese patrols are aggressively sweeping the valleys. The American flyers are exhausted, many are injured, and they are utterly dependent on the local population. This is where the gung-ho spirit of the mission meets the ancient resilience of the Chinese people. The rescue effort is a bucket brigade of humanity. Wounded airmen, some with broken limbs or severe burns, are carried in sedan chairs or on simple wooden stretchers by Chinese villagers. These caravans move primarily at night to avoid the Zero fighters prowling the skies. They traverse muddy trails that cling to the sides of steep gorges, moving from village to village. At each stop, the Americans are fed rice and tea, their wounds are dressed with traditional medicines, and they are hidden in cellars or caves. The language barrier is bridged by hand signals, smiles, and the shared understanding of a common enemy. The journey to safety is not a matter of days but weeks. The raiders are moved deeper into the interior, toward Chongqing, the wartime capital of Free China. It is a trek of endurance. The pilots, navigators, and gunners, accustomed to the technological supremacy of the cockpit, are now infantrymen in a guerrilla war. They witness firsthand the devastation the Japanese occupation has wrought on China, the burned villages, the starving refugees, the omnipresent fear. It is a sobering education for the young Americans, cementing a bond between the two nations that is forged in blood and shared sacrifice. As the survivors slowly trickle back into Allied control, the strategic picture in the Pacific is shifting with tectonic force. The Doolittle Raid has done exactly what President Roosevelt hoped it would do, but the mechanism is different than anticipated. The physical damage to the Tokyo factories is repaired within weeks. The oil tanks are patched and refilled, rendering the material impact of the strike almost negligible. Yet the psychological wound festers, driving the Japanese military to launch a punitive campaign of unimaginable brutality against the provinces that sheltered the Americans. In a tragic exchange for the raid's success, an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians will pay the ultimate price. If you would like more war stories from World War II, please like this video and subscribe to our channel.